And we begin with President Trump's escalating threat to take over Greenland, either by economic leverage or military force, and the intensifying backlash from Europe and NATO allies. Over the weekend, President Trump threatening to impose 10% tariffs starting on February 1st on 8 European countries opposed to the U.S. takeover, including Denmark, France, Germany, and the U.K., saying those tariff rates will climb to 25% in June. There is not a deal for the, quote, complete and total purchase of Greenland. Yesterday on Meet the Press, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent defending the latest tariff threats.
President Trump is being strategic. He's looking beyond this year. He's looking beyond next year to what could happen for a battle in the Arctic. We are not going to outsource our national security. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to other countries.
What is the national emergency that justifies these new slate of tariffs?
The national emergency is avoiding a national emergency.
Today, President Trump showing no signs of backing down. In an exclusive phone interview with NBC News, when asked if he will follow through on those tariffs, absent a deal on Greenland, President Trump saying, quote, "I will, 100%. And when asked if he would use force to seize Greenland, President Trump saying, no comment. The pushback from Greenland and Europe has been intense. On Saturday, at least 1,000 Greenlanders marching in opposition to a U.S. takeover, waving their national flags and reiterating the territory is not for sale. Some demonstrators wearing their own version of a MAGA hat. Make America go away. This was their message to the U.S. president.
This is a fight for freedom. It's for NATO. It's for everything the Western Hemisphere has been fighting for since World War II.
I hope that this focus of taking control of Greenland, total control of Greenland, will no longer, that will disappear again. We just want to live in quiet and peace and with each other in this great country.
It's surreal and it's unreal to be part of that circus he's doing right now.
And meanwhile, European leaders are weighing their response. Germany and France equating the latest tariff threats to blackmail. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also condemning the escalation.
But we must stand up for our values. We must be clear about the principles that we are applying here, and will continue to do so. Threatening tariffs on allies is the wrong thing to do, completely wrong. And a trade war is not in our interests.
All of this comes as Norway's prime minister went public with a recent message he received from President Trump, where Trump blamed Norway for not giving him the Nobel Peace Prize, saying, quote, "I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." President Trump went on to repeat his claim that Denmark cannot protect Greenland from Russia and China. We should note, Norway's government does not play a role in awarding the Nobel Peace Prize. And joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent and chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell, and NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. Thank you all so much for joining me. Garrett, I want to start with you at the White House. What should we make of this recent escalation between President Trump and European allies? Is there any off-ramp the president would accept, or is it all for nothing?
Yeah, I mean, Gabe, the irony of all this is there are plenty of off-ramps available to the president here that would accomplish his stated goals of trying to improve U.S. security in the Arctic. The Danes and the Greenlandic people have all said they would welcome more U.S. involvement. We have some bases there already. There's the option to open more. Everything the president says he wants is on the table. When I'm confused in a situation like this, I try to think through the kind of art of the deal framework here. And to me, that suggests that what we may be seeing from the president here is to try to kind of create this maximalist position to get a better bargain if there ultimately is an opportunity to buy Greenland. Our own reporting at NBC News has been that the price tag could be as high as $700 billion. That's money we don't have. Perhaps the president sees this pressure campaign and the ambiguity around military force as a way to make Greenland ultimately cheaper, but it does seem to be very much having the opposite effect in the democratic nations whose people are now hardening their opposition to U.S. involvement there at all.
Yeah, you know, Garrett and our colleague Kristen Welker asked the Treasury Secretary whether this may be part of some negotiation. He kind of dodged that question. But Garrett, I want to ask you about, does the president have the political capital to prolong this fight over Greenland? We've been looking at that polling, right, that says that, you know, a vast majority of Americans would be opposed to any military takeover of Greenland. Does he really want to burn political capital on this?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are bad for the president in public opinion surveys. Deeply underwater, disapproval ratings in the 70, high 80%, depending on the options that are put before the American people. If the president wants to press this issue, he's going to have to sell it a lot more, Gabe. I mean, I covered the entirety of his presidential campaign. This was not a stump speech issue. This was not something like the deportation campaigns, for example, that the president broadly previewed for the American people. This is something that he talked about a little bit in the first term. He's become very focused on it in the second term. He's faced significant but not overwhelming pushback from elected Republicans. I think to really shut this down, you would need to see more outspokenness from elected Republicans and perhaps a stronger market reaction. The markets have been notably cool on all of this so far.
You know, Garrett, you mentioned the slight pushback from some elected Republicans. During the president's first term, we often talked about the adults in the room, right? So is there anyone within the president's inner circle right now who is urging restraint?
It doesn't appear to be so, Gabe, and I think it's important that people remember this is a very different team with a very different way of thinking about how they serve President Trump. In the first term, there were so many hands around him who felt like it was their job to try to channel him in some way or prevent his worst instincts or instincts they disagreed with from becoming policy. That's not the case here. From Susie Wiles to Stephen Miller to the vice president, this is a team around President Trump who believes it is their job to take his ideas and put them into practice to the best ability that they can. And so the idea that he'll be talked out of this by someone who works in the building behind me, I think is extraordinarily unlikely.
Garrett Haake, live for us at the White House. Garrett, thank you. I want to turn now to Andrea Mitchell here with me on set. Andrea, how significant a rift is President Trump causing with Europe right now? How is Europe looking to potentially respond? There's talk of this so-called trade bazooka. Fill us in.
I mean, it is extraordinarily angering to our NATO allies. It could, as the Danish Prime Minister said, it could absolutely destroy NATO, because this is the first time in history, and we're talking about 76 years of post-war NATO history, which has succeeded to get France and Germany to stop fighting with each other, to keep peace in Europe until, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And this would be the first time that NATO would be challenged from inside, from a NATO member, and the most important member, the United States, of course. So the president's been so successful in getting NATO to do what it needed to do, which is to come up to a 5% goal of spending. They've not been spending enough.
And he's repeated that very often. He's been successful in that.
Article 1 for him, and he actually should be, praising NATO for acceding to him. He's dominating NATO and Europe, and instead he's challenging them in a way that is so profound and is so angering. You've seen a couple of, the Germans sent 2 days of reconnaissance mission, 13 people in that mission, but there was a symbolic reconnaissance mission, but they are determined that they will retaliate. They had put tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, on hold at the end of last year, but now they're resurrecting that, and they're hoping that in Davos, where the president will be going in the next couple of days, that in Davos that there is some off-ramp. But the off-ramp is so clear. We have 1 base and 200 troops. We had 17 bases, 10,000 troops at the high point. We have a 1951 treaty with Denmark over Greenland.
And Denmark said we could have more. We could have more troops there.
We could have more troops that we could build up again. NATO is willing to spend this money. So it is a crisis, or he's created a crisis without a predicate. And they say they haven't seen a Chinese warship in 10 years. Certainly the Russians are there. The Arctic is important. And now he's talking about Canada again. And just as Mark Carney, the leader of Canada, has gone to China to pivot away from the U.S.
So you mentioned, it is a concern, at least, potentially with Russia and China. But we heard Secretary Bessent tell Kristen Welker a little earlier in the program that the national emergency is to avoid a national emergency.
That is circular reasoning.
Okay.
Bessent is supposedly the grown-up in the room on the Jay Powell issue and other big issues, and on tariffs to a certain extent. Bessent here is just saluting.
Okay. Well, you mentioned Davos. I'm curious, you've covered this for a very long time. How awkward do you think some of these conversations will be there? How do you think that all of this will overshadow whatever message the president was hoping to send at Davos?
Well, it certainly will overshadow the message, but also people don't understand. People who dealt with diplomacy, with treaties, and he's got opposition in the Senate to this. And it would be $700 to $800 billion, according to the best estimates that NBC had published, to even buy it. But he told the New York Times when they said, well, you could have it without buying it, he said, I don't like to rent, or I like to buy. I like to own things, is basically the paraphrase. So no one really understands the mentality. To him, it's the biggest real estate deal. It's his legacy. He sees it as Jeffersonian. Jefferson got the Louisiana Purchase. Sewell got the Arctic. But it's the biggest possible land deal, but it is so antithetical to American interests.
Andrea Mitchell, our Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to turn now to Brian Chung. Brian, what would these 10% tariffs mean for consumers here in the U.S.? What kind of goods likely would be impacted?
Well, Gabe, as we've been covering throughout all of these tariffs, it would impact any imports coming into this country because, as we know, is the way that these tariffs have operated so far, it is the American companies that are importing them that are paying most of those costs. In fact, there was a recent report just in the last few days that suggested almost 100%, well over 90% of those tariffs are borne by American companies that are importing those goods, not the exporting country like the European Union in the case of the tariffs that we're talking about here. But there are a lot of practical questions over exactly what the president plans on doing here. Yes, there was that pretty detailed Truth Social post where just on the graphic we showed you, there are 8 countries that would be targeted under these tariffs. It would be 10% beginning on February 1st. That would ratchet up to 25% once we get to June. Well, yes, indeed, even though it's only 8 countries that are being targeted, there is a question over whether or not it is de facto an entire tariff on the European Union because of the fact that European goods, when they come to this country, are not designated as a country of origin for, let's say, France or Finland. It's just bucketed as the European Union. So it's actually unclear if the president will be able to tariff just individually those 8 countries. Some in the European Union are treating this as an entire tariff on the whole block. And you'd imagine that would raise prices pretty substantially for the many European goods that we import here in the United States.
And, Brian, we were talking about this a little bit with Andrea, but the European Union is threatening to retaliate with its own tariffs. What could that look like?
Yeah, well, these are countermeasures that were actually floated by the European Union, as Andrew was saying, at the end of last year. They were put on ice as part of the cooling of negotiations between the United States and the European Union. But it'd be about $110 billion U.S. dollars on goods like, for example, agricultural products, industrial goods, Boeing airplanes. That's a big deal because of the rivalry between Boeing and the French Airbus company. But these are tariffs that would be effectively put back into place if it is indeed the case that European Union feels the need to escalate it to that point. This is the card that they are leaning on in response to these Greenland threats. But again, whether or not they actually get there, they did not ultimately implement them last year. We'll see if this is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back and forcing them to do so.
And, Brian, as if we didn't have enough news to follow already in 2026, we're also waiting for the Supreme Court's ruling on some of the president's tariffs. Would that ruling, how would these latest tariff threats, what would happen if the Supreme Court struck down these tariffs?
Well, there is a bit of uncertainty around that because we don't know what legal authority the president is trying to lean on to implement this new round of tariffs on those 8 countries that he described. Presumably, it would be under the same statute that he was trying to implement those Rose Garden tariffs, as you recall, which were shown on that flashy poster board in the Rose Garden in April of last year. In this case, he would be using it essentially in a different way, saying that to the Secretary of the Treasury's words, this is an emergency situation that the United States needs Greenland to protect its own interests from any sort of potential military action from Russia or China. Make of that what you will and whether or not those threats are even substantive. But if they are the case, the Supreme Court could look at it from a different perspective. If they are ruling tomorrow, again, that's the next day that we're expecting opinions on the IEEPA tariffs, even if they did strike the tariffs from last year away, maybe under the way and the framing that the president wants to introduce these new ones, they they could still uphold those. But again, I wouldn't expect the Supreme Court to rule that quickly. And in fact, it might even be the case SCOTUS kicks it to a lower court to decide exactly how the IEEPA law is applied to tariffs going forward, Gabe.
Brian Chung, a lot to watch out for in the coming weeks and months. Brian, thanks. And joining me now from Denmark is Rufus Gifford, former U.S. ambassador to Denmark. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now.
Pleasure to be with you anytime.
And Ambassador, so what are you hearing from officials in Denmark about these threats by the president to take over Greenland?
Okay, but I honestly, I think what you hear from the officials, meaning the government officials, is widely reported, I think, from the press. Obviously, there's extreme anxiety, concern, anger, frustration, and all that's palpable. But what I think is underreported in the U.S., and this is something that I've been struck by, and I just landed this morning, so I've only just been here less than a day, and you can feel it on the streets, and a lot of Danes know who I am just because I've spoken. I've been a fairly public figure here, and I've even just over the course of the day have been stopped on the streets by the average Danes. By 2 policemen stopped me today, said thanked me for what I've been doing and speaking out, but also what's going on, what's happening to the United States. Don't you understand that there's so much on the line here? It is profound, and as someone who has spent a lot of time, obviously, all throughout Europe, but in particular here, I've never had a trip that's felt like this, and I was here just a couple of months ago.
Well, the president is now threatening these new tariffs, as we've been reporting. How much pressure does that put on these European countries, and how much damage could it do to their economies?
Well, I think it's this. The weird part is, I think we are at a time in this crisis, and I do call it a crisis, that we're beyond thinking through just the short-term economic impact of any particular tariff that the White House might threaten, put on tomorrow, take off the next day. I think that's less of a concern for the individual European countries and even the EU as a whole. What I think is considerably more of a concern for these European leaders, for NATO as an institution, as an alliance, is where we go from here. And that might mean making some tough choices. And that might mean, say, retaliatory tariffs. That might mean the bazooka that Macron talked about a couple of days ago. So my point is that, yes, I think that they might suffer, but they are willing, in my mind, most of the Europeans I know are willing to take that risk considering what's on the line.
Well, Ambassador, you mentioned the NATO alliance, and President Trump just this morning told NBC News no comment on whether the U.S. would seize Greenland by force. Now, if he were to do that, and of course the idea sounded so far-fetched not that long ago, if he were to do that, what would the implications be? Could the U.S. be at war with NATO?
Well, that's the thing. And this alliance, which let's not forget what this alliance is. This alliance is hands down the most successful alliance the modern world has ever seen. It's been an extraordinary deterrent. We've never seen the only time, say, Article 5 of NATO has been invoked, which is an enemy of NATO attacking a NATO ally, was after 9/11, when the United States invoked Article 5 and the entire alliance came to our defense. I think it is hard to see how this alliance survives any sort of hostile takeover of Greenland, whether that is militarily or some other coercive action. It is hard to see that, largely because, NATO is an alliance that is built on this kind of idea of mutual trust and respect, and this idea that our national security is in line with the national security of the entire alliance. And this threat from the Trump administration undermines kind of exactly what NATO is as an institution, as an alliance, as an organization. So it's hard to see how it survives.
And Ambassador, just this morning we learned that President Trump has tied this fight to the Nobel Peace Prize and suggesting that he's no longer obligated to think purely of peace. Now, is that something world leaders should take seriously or literally?
Well, it's an extraordinary statement, Gabe, and I think that this is where we are in my mind. Look, Greenland says they're not for sale. Denmark says that Greenland's not for sale. The EU says Greenland's not for sale. NATO says the EU's Greenland is not for sale. 70+% of Americans don't want to acquire Greenland either by force or by purchase. At what point is this in American national security interests versus the interests of one man? Because we can't articulate anymore a national security argument that holds water. So it is very hard in my mind to see where we go from here, considering just the sheer absurdity of things like the letter you just referenced.
Well, you mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, how people were stopping on the street, even today. Well, we did see members of Congress travel to Denmark to try and reassure members of parliament there. But do their words carry any weight, especially at a time when we see the president increasingly flex his power on the world stage?
Yeah, I think the answer is that it matters. It matters a tremendous amount. And my friends here, and I have spoken, in full disclosure, I was speaking with the delegation both before the trip and I've spoken with them after the trip. The trip was extraordinarily well received. I think even more so because it was bipartisan and you had Tillis and Murkowski on the trip. Do I wish it had happened a year ago when the president was making these threats against Greenland? Yes. It came way too late as far as I'm concerned, but I'm glad it happened. And it was extremely well received from the Danes. That being said, we need to put some teeth behind some of the words that are being said by these senators, meaning bills do need to be passed in the House and Senate to avoid what I think would be this just extraordinary conflict that I believe that will make all Americans weaker, and it only serve to empower our adversaries in Russia and China because of the weakening of NATO.
Well, former Ambassador Rufus Gifford, we thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.